think we can like to say thanks so much to my club, Conservative McGill, our fellow young conservative clubs, Conservative Concordia. This event's also co-hosted by some CEGEPs, including the Dawson Conservatives and the John Abbott Conservatives as well. And I'd also like to point out we have some representatives here from Liberal McGill and NDP McGill. This is something that, as conservatives, you know, we're very, we pride ourselves on being open to a healthy discussion and free discourse. So that's something that we're very proud to talk about today. I'd like to introduce today Andrew Scheer, who's the leader of Her Majesty's Loyal Opposition. And just in May this year, he was elected as the new leader of the Conservative Party with a majority vote in a leadership race that had 14 candidates. Now, Andrew was first elected when he was 25 years old in 2004. He's originally from Ottawa, but he's represented the riding of Regina Capel since he was 25 in 2004. In 2011, he became the youngest Speaker of the House of Commons in Canadian history. So, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Andrew Scheer, the next Prime Minister of Canada.
Merci beaucoup pour cet accueil très très chaleureux. C'est un grand honneur pour moi d'être ici à McGill. As an Ottawa U alum, I want to say it's great to be here. You guys have always been very welcoming to Gigi's when we come and visit McGill, and it's a great honor to be on this historic campus. Ce n'est pas mon première fois à Montréal, comme vous pouvez devenir, parce que comme un natif d'Ottawa, j'ai passé beaucoup des fêtes de semaine ici à Montréal avec mes amis pendant mes années d'université. Des très bonnes mémoires de quelques temps ici quand j'étais à l'université. Alors, je vais parler aujourd'hui sur quelques enjeux et aussi sur ma vision positive pour la partie conservateur. I'm happy to talk about a few issues today and just kind of deal with the overall state of where the Conservative Party is and how I believe we will be successful in the next election. And I want to pay special thanks to representatives from the NDP and Liberal clubs because I believe that those in those political parties are just not yet conservatives. And as they develop their political thinking and become more aware of the facts, then they'll be here one day. But honestly, it's great to have you here, as I do believe that it's important to have respectful debate around issues, and any party that becomes closed off to people who support other parties is unlikely to grow. So a big part of my campaign is how we can bring people who today are voting for other parties into the fold in the future. So a little bit about myself. As I mentioned, I grew up in Ottawa, and when I was about 24 years old, I moved to Saskatchewan. I met my wife, Jill, while she was at the University of Ottawa, but she is from Regina, so I followed her out to the prairies when she moved there to finish her degree. I was an insurance broker by trade when I got elected in 2004, and then as you know, for those of you who are interested in leadership process, we had a very competitive race. In true conservative fashion, we had a very free market competitive process where I think at one time there were 16 candidates, if you count some of the people who started and then didn't make it to the end. So a very wide variety of opinions were presented. And you know, along the way, the media liked to poke fun at that a little bit, didn't they? They said there were too many people running. We had too many candidates. It did make our debates a little bit challenging, but you know, essentially the message was we had too many people willing to sacrifice their time away from their friends and family and go out and rebuild the Conservative Party of Canada. We had too many people going out selling memberships, bringing new people into the fold. Too many people coming up with innovative conservative ideas that would resonate with the next generation of conservatives. And you know, along the way, having too many people doing all that, we grew our party membership from around 75,000 people to over 250,000 members strong. Those are problems that I like to have as a leader of a national party. Now, a big challenge for the Conservative Party is how we connect with young Canadians, and so I'm so thrilled to see this room full of Conservative supporters and activists, because clearly clearly what we're doing is working. We need to do more of it. We need to find new ways to grow. So I'm going to be counting on you for that advice and for that hard work to bring the conservative message to others on campus so that we can grow our party and have a stronger base among young people. And I've always felt I was a conservative all through university, and sometimes it was challenging at Ottawa U. I remember running the recruitment table during Frosh Week, the first couple of weeks of university, the campus drive, membership drives, and sometimes it's challenging to get that message out to young people. But I believe that it's very essential that we find the right way of connecting, because we know that it's conservative principles and policies that actually help young Canadians as they leave school and look forward to having opportunities for them in their life. And conversely, all the things that young people tell pollsters and ask what they care about, we know that it's left-wing liberal policies that actually hurt the very people that they claim to help. And that's kind of the main message of what I've been talking about during my time in leadership, that no matter what the issue is, as you look towards solutions, liberal and NEP policies always make the problem worse. They always lead to less prosperity and less growth in a society. I think the problem for conservatives sometimes is that we don't always finish the sentence. We don't speak to what motivates us as conservatives. And we tend to kind of get trapped talking about data points like debt to GDP ratios and return on investment and GDP growth, and sometimes we don't do what the left does so well, which is go directly to how it impacts people. And I find to our friends in the NDP and Liberals who are there, I tip my hat to you because you often bring that human element into it very early. But unfortunately, the policies of the left, once they get past the emotional signal that they're sending, are always very disastrous for the people that they claim to help. So in other words, when we talk about balanced budgets, we can't just put the period at the end of the sentence, at the end of that word. We have to finish it. We have to go on beyond that. Why do we want a balanced budget? Well, we want a balanced budget because we don't think it's just to borrow money from my kids. I've got 5 kids, ages 2 to 12, and they will be saddled with the debt that Justin Trudeau is racking up. More and more of their tax dollars as they go through life will be going to pay back spending today. That's not fair. Nobody leaves a credit card bill to their kids. Taxes go up to pay back that debt, services get reduced. The Canada Revenue Agency has to go out and find more and more dollars out of your pockets, out of working families, to pay for the debt. More and more of your tax dollar goes to pay interest payments to banks and bondholders, international hedge funds. So that's why we oppose balanced budgets. It's not just because we don't like red ink on the paper. When you look at some of the policies Liberals claim to help, they raise payroll taxes with a view towards helping people with retirement security. But we know that that doesn't work. We know that those payroll taxes go up and fewer people have jobs. And the first people who lose their job when it becomes more expensive for employers to hire people are young people, new entrants into the workforce, new Canadians who haven't yet developed the skills or experience to retain their job when employers have to make tough decisions. So we have to package our rock-solid conservative principles in a way that really speaks not just to young people, but anyone who doesn't yet realize that it's conservative principles and policies that address the issues that they care most about. So when I took over the leadership, quand j'ai été élu comme chef de la partie le 27 mai, je cherche un enjeu. I was looking for an issue that I could introduce myself to Canadians on. And on July 18th, Bill Morneau decided to do that for me. And he launched his tax hike on local businesses. Now, when I was paying my way through university, my parents were very generous. I had a great mom and dad. They gave me free room and board, and they bought my bus pass for me every month. Other than that, I was on my own, so I had to pay my own tuition and my own books and any other spending money I wanted. So I got a job at a small business. I was a waiter in a restaurant. Now, that small business owner put everything he had on the line to run that restaurant. And sometimes, some months he was successful, some months it was probably kind of tight. But one of the primary beneficiaries of that risk that he took was me. I got to have a job. I got to pay my tuition with the hard work that I put out for that small business. And when he succeeded, when he was successful, the more people that came in to eat at that restaurant, the better off I was as well. So we shared in that prosperity. And that's the fundamental lie of the left, is that when they attack prosperity, when their view is only to achieve equality by tearing people down, they make everyone worse off and less free. And the fundamental difference, I believe, between those on the left and those who believe in freedom and liberty is that when you look towards government, when you look to the compelling, the coercive power of the state as the solution to every problem, you always make people less free and less prosperous. So, I really enjoyed the grassroots tax revolt that went on this summer. It was great to watch, people from chambers of commerce to the agriculture, small businesses who didn't want their jobs threatened, really come together without a lot of central organization, just in a grassroots way, fighting back against these tax changes. I really enjoyed some of the social media interactions. There was a great picture on Twitter of a farmer on a tractor tweeting out, "Hey, Justin Trudeau, just here in my tax shelter trying to get the crop off before frost." And a shop owner opening up at 7 a.m. saying, "Hey, Bill Morneau, just about to start my day avoiding paying my fair share of taxes." But the Liberals weren't entirely wrong about everything, were they? Because there were some wealthy Canadians who like to use fancy accounting schemes to avoid paying higher taxes. All they had to do, though, if they were looking for those types of people, it was to turn slightly towards each other. Justin Trudeau and Bill Morneau could have just gazed into each other's eyes, and they could have left the rest of hardworking Canadians across the country just trying to build a better society and community alone. So I want to end there because I know that was kind of the hot topic of the summer. I'm happy to touch on any issue. I know at a university like McGill, it's not just economics, it's not just job prospects, no matter what department you're in. You probably have a take on many different issues from environment to quality of life in big cities to housing. So I'm happy to deal with any of those in the Q&A. I love getting to the question and answer part as quickly as possible because then we can talk about the issues that are important to you. So thanks so much for being here. I'll stop there and happy to open up to questions.
And I think it's pretty clear why the Conservative Party of Canada is bigger and stronger than it's ever been before. And it's not just at the federal level, but it's also right here on campus. I mean, Conservative McGill is 3 times as big as it's ever been, and Mr. Scheer is a large fruit. So as we promised, we're going to open up the floor to questions in a town hall style question system. We'd prefer to begin with, to open up the questions to some of our young Conservatives and young members of the McGill community who came here, and we'll go on from there. So if you have a question, raise your hand, and we'll let you ask a question, Mr. Scheer.
Yeah.
Okay, hi, Mr. Scheer. Congrats on becoming a leader. I think you're going to do a great job. You're doing a great job. I have my question is about an issue that's the top priority for about 2 million Canadians, but it's not often talked about, and that's the issue of U.S. taxes. So there's about 2 million Canadians who have to pay U.S. taxes. The U.S. is one of the only 2 countries in the world that charge their citizens taxes, even though they don't live or work there. We've condemned the other country. It's a country called Eritrea in Africa. We've expelled their ambassador. But on the U.S. side, we actually turn over millions of records of Canadians who have to pay U.S. taxes. Now, there are a couple of treaties. There are a few treaties that lower the burden for some Canadians, but there's many other things that aren't covered. So, for example, TFSAs and RESPs. An American Canadian, someone who was born in Canada, perhaps born in Canada, lived in Canada his whole life, he has to send a portion of his RESPs for his children's education. He has to send it to Washington, D.C. every year. There's no tax-free savings. There's no American Canadians do not have that option.
So go ahead and ask your question.
It's very, very expensive to renounce U.S. citizenship. It can cost upwards of $10,000, $3,000 in fees to the State Department, and many thousands in professional fees. So my question is, I'll skip a bunch, but the question essentially is: Are you willing, or is there willpower in the Conservative Party to confront the United States about the way that they tax their citizens? We, as Canadians, we don't tax Canadian citizens who have moved to the U.S. and work in the U.S., but they tax U.S. citizens who live and work here, and it's upwards in the billions of dollars of Canadian money and productivity that gets sent south of the border each year.
Short answer, yes, absolutely. I do think that it's up to the Canadian government should continue to try to put pressure on the United States to treat dual citizens living in Canada in a more compassionate and in a more just way. I can tell you, I was first made aware of this issue by a constituent who happened to be born, I think it was in Arizona, because her parents were stationed there while they were in school. Had never lived in the U.S. beyond her first 8 months of her life, and came to Canada, grew up, lived there, but had an Arizona birth certificate. She started reading some stories. I think it was the Globe and Mail spent a lot of time of 4 or 5 years ago, really bringing this to light. And the initial response from the U.S. Embassy that I was working with was, yes, she will have to pay all the penalties, because it wasn't just about the fact that she'd have to file, but with what's called the F-bars, the U.S. Treasury had placed an obligation not just to file taxes, but also to report all funds in offshore accounts. Now, to a Canadian with a checking account or a savings account at CIBC or the Royal Bank, you don't think that an offshore account, that would qualify as an offshore account, but to the Treasury, that was offshore because it wasn't in the United States. And so people were facing 25% penalties of the total amount of savings that they had. Now, the previous government, the Conservative government, was engaged on this right away, and we managed to put pressure on the United States so that they eliminated the penalties for anybody, any dual citizen who had properly complied with all Canadian tax laws, that they could show that they were in compliance and that they would basically have those penalties waived. So we made a lot of progress, but I still hear horror stories and like you said, excessive fees. Some people have come to me and shown me $25,000 in accounting fees to file all their back taxes just to be in compliance, just to get to the point where they could renounce their citizenship. Because the other thing the United States does is when you renounce your citizenship, if they deem that you're doing it to avoid filing with the IRS, they will just slap on, I can't remember the term is, but they basically charge you a tax as if you were in non-compliance in the US. So it's very very burdensome, and it's very punitive for a lot of people who have never benefited from a US good or service, never benefited from US medical coverage or anything like that. So yes, I believe it's important that our government continues to push to protect dual citizens here in Canada.
Hello, Kyle Matthews, Executive Director of the Montreal Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies. It was announced this week that Canadians who joined ISIS are being allowed to return to Canada, and they're going to be allowed to reintegrate. And I find that interesting because at the same time, due to Michelle Rempel's advocacy that she was able to get the Canadian government to resettle 1,200 Yazidi women and children who were victims of ISIS genocide, sexual slavery, and some of the worst crimes against humanity on the planet. So I'm wondering, if you were a Yazidi refugee resettled in Canada, how would you feel about this message and what it sends to them for their protection?
This to me is just completely outrageous. When we talk about reintegration and rehabilitation, I'll talk about preventing radicalization as well, but when we talk about reintegration and rehabilitation, often the connotation there is for criminals who have spent time in custody and now have been released. They've either fulfilled their term or been granted parole. And we all recognize as a society that you've got much better success to put services in place to help people adjust back into society. So skills training, sometimes it's addictions counseling, and because you want to make sure they don't reoffend, and you want to provide them with services to avoid that. We're all better off when we have successful reintegration in society, when we're talking about people like that. What we're talking about in this case, with people who have chosen to go and fight for ISIS, we're not talking about a 19-year-old kid who stole a few cars and now you want to give him a second chance at life by giving him tools to avoid falling back into criminality. We're talking about people who became radicalized, who chose to leave Canada, booked a one-way flight to Istanbul or Ankara, got on a bus to the border, then disappeared for a period of time, and now are coming back. These are people who fought for an organization that watched soldiers, that put soldiers in cages and set them on fire, who rounded up girls from villages and sold them off as sex slaves around the world. These are the most heinous crimes conceivable committed against our fellow human beings. And these are people who went there to fight for that organization and now have come back. They have not been held accountable for the crimes that they've committed and participated in. So when we talk about reintegration for that I asked Justin Trudeau this week, tell me what a program of reintegration would look like when you're talking about people who watch people burn alive in cages, or who pushed homosexuals off of buildings just for being gay. Where do you start with a reintegration program? Today we find out that some of it involves poetry classes, which I would ask you to tell me how writing a sonnet can be therapeutic for people who have participated in essentially what are crimes against humanity. I believe the focus should be on giving our law enforcement and national security agencies the tools they need to prosecute. These people need to be in jail. These people need to pay for the crimes that they've committed.
Go ahead. Go ahead, yeah.
Okay.
You've been waiting patiently. Go ahead.
Hi, Andrew. My name is Kemi. I'm actually a Concordia student. So I know that freedom of speech is an issue that really matters to you, and I wanted to know if there's any form of speech that you would disagree with being funded or that you wouldn't support on university campuses.
Sure. I get this question a lot, as you may know. It was one of my central. It was a key part of my leadership campaign. It was a policy that I announced that I would structure federal funding agreements with universities to ensure that there was a regime in place to protect the free speech. So there are federal programs available for research, federally funded research grants, and the government prioritizes who is eligible for those types of grants. I said, the Liberals have already used some of the criteria to achieve certain social goals. They've announced diversity targets, so they want the universities they want the funding to be prioritized to universities who have reached the targets that this Liberal government sets out for various aspects of diversity, different targets on that. So I said, well, they've basically endorsed the idea that you can use that model to achieve a social goal. And I believe very firmly that protecting freedom of speech is a social goal that we should all be very concerned about. For those of you that have followed what's happened at Laurier University, which I think is just an outrageous attack on the fundamental principles of free speech and the inquisitorial style that they went after this teaching assistant who, I've been told, is not necessarily conservative. She's made a lot of public statements that she was not picking a side in the debate that she was presenting. She had the audacity to show a clip from a public broadcaster, TV Ontario. Steve Paikin was the interviewer, had two sides of the debate. And I love coming here and having these kinds of discussions. I'm sure our NDP and Liberal friends in the room enjoy the opportunity to challenge me and ask me to defend my point of view, and I love to be forced to do that and challenge them back. I believe that within the confines, within the fundamental principles that we have in this country about hate speech and inciting to violence, we can come up with a regime that has encourages respectful debate, but also protects that fundamental freedom. There's a reason why freedom of speech comes so early on in the Charter of Rights and Freedom, because we lose all our democratic rights, all our other kinds of rights are eroded when we lose the right to express ourselves and to hold controversial ideas and to advocate for them. And every authoritarian state always starts with attacks on freedom of speech. It always starts to curtail people's ability to criticize what's going on. And I don't think we should allow extreme examples of offensive and odious speech where people project hateful messages, which I absolutely condemn. We should not use that as an excuse to allow what happened at Laurier University, which was so egregious and outrageous.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Mr. Scheer, I interned at the Canadian Taxpayers Federation this summer, and Conservatives often talk a good game about dealing with government waste and attacking the bureaucracy. How would your Conservative government deal with that, and where would you start?
I think if we go back to first principles and say what is the fundamental role of government, and we get government just to operate in those essential spheres. Pierre Trudeau famously said that the state has no place in the bedrooms of the nation. And I believe that we can all agree with that we don't want the state to dictate our private lives and the types of relationships we have. However, the state sure set up shop in every other room in the house and went into the living room and kitchen and dining room, and the state is in every aspect of our life now, telling us what channels it's okay for us to watch and even what magazines we're allowed to read. It over-regulates every aspect of our lives. And as a result, government gets very big. So I believe a lot of the times it's not as to whether or not a liberal or conservative government can manage departments or programs better than the other. You know, so sometimes people say, well, maybe the conservatives can do a better job managing and avoiding waste. I believe we can, absolutely. I believe we're more focused on that, and it bothers us more when there is waste. The Liberals seem to be fine with that, and they don't target it the way we do. You can look at the $200,000 spent on the budget cover page. You can look on ministerial renovations. You know, there's so many examples where the waste just doesn't bother them. It does bother us. But beyond that, I think it's a question of, can government do it properly at all? Is it the role of government to be providing all of these kinds of services? And I think it's time for a conversation about, one of the problems with people, with many of those on the left side of the spectrum is that they immediately look to government to solve problems. Well, there's a whole lot of society beyond government. There's not-for-profit organizations. There's different levels of government. There's the volunteer sector of society that are often better equipped to deal with some of the challenges that we ask government to do. So my vision includes leveraging the power of not-for-profits, volunteer group, private sector solutions to help address these issues. Government doesn't have to be the deliverer of every aspect of assistance in our life, or every program. We can make sure that there is funding, they can make sure that the programs are set up, but that there are many different models that can deliver those types of things far more efficiently than government.
Hi, Mr. Scheer. Thank you so much for being here. My question also pertains to freedom of speech and the events that happened at Laurier, and I'm just going to ask you to be as apolitical as you can, because it's an issue where I would like a response that is as apolitical as possible. Do you believe that condemning what happened at Laurier, and I thank you for your position, I happen to agree with it, do you think that that position is very divided on partisan lines, or do you find that there is consensus among the parties on this issue? If you do believe that it is divided on partisan lines, why is that, and what can be done to change that?
That's an excellent question, one that I'll have to kind of ponder on. Let me say this, I have seen evidence that restrictions on free speech does bother people associated with other parties more on the left. I have heard that NDP and Liberal supporters will be very upset at the fact that free speech is being trampled like that, because they believe they're right, and they believe that with the power of their arguments that they can persuade people on the other side that they are wrong, and they should have the ability to do that. And I think there's a sense, especially among really engaged people, that go beyond just the issue being talked about, and kind of take a few steps beyond that and say, once we grant an authority, whether it's a university or a level of government, once we grant them the power to decide what kind of speech is permissible or not. Today, it might be great for your political persuasion. It'd be great, the people I disagree with are being silenced. So that helps me out. It makes it more likely that my side is going to win. But I think there are a lot of people on all sides of the spectrum that recognize that once you give that power to an authority, that can change. And once you concede the principle that higher levels of authority can determine what kind of speech is right, then today it's great for you, but tomorrow it might not be. And you wouldn't want that to happen to your side. And I think as long as we can keep that as our fundamental guiding principle, we can navigate through this in a way that doesn't devolve where people conjure up images of just students being bombarded by hateful messages as they try to get to class. And I think sometimes that's a false image that is presented to justify an infringement, an undue infringement on our basic fundamental human right.
Hi, Andrew. Thank you for a good speech. Daniela Kigo, National Council of Women of Canada, Immigration, Refugees, Global Affairs, United Nations, Commission Status of Women. I would like to follow up on Kyle's question. In 2014, the RCMP reported that we had 180 jihadists. Actually, I call them terrorists because they cannot be called otherwise. It would be an insult to all the refugees to call them otherwise. They are not fighters. They didn't fight any right war. Therefore, in 2016, it was reported that there were total 80 who might have tried to come back to Canada. In the meantime, they have decreased by 20, which means it's been promoted number 60 as we have 60 terrorists back in Canada. Will the government be capable of providing us with the exact numbers and a solution of not only to punish them, but prior to that, how do we prevent and contain them from actions?
Well, it's always very difficult to get a very straight answer out of the government. I don't know if you've been following question period these days in some of the testimony at committee, but whether it's a simple question as to when the budget will be balanced or what's in Bill Morneau's number of companies, they are fundamentally incapable of just, here's the answer. Now, in fairness, sometimes questions in question period are designed not to be answerable, but we've tried over the past few weeks to answer very specific questions. You know, when, on what date. So we asked Ralph Goodell a very specific question on the number. He's very careful with his language. You know, I don't have the transcript right in front of me, but it was 60. But you know, it was linked to 60 who are under surveillance, 60 who are being monitored, and all that. Well, that may not include others who, for one reason or another, you know, have stopped being monitored, or that they've lost track of, which is another big problem. When I was Speaker of the House of Commons, I was on a trip to Turkey, and I met with officials there who showed me, you know, evidence that they had of Canadians who had become radicalized, who went to Turkey and then disappeared. And you know, there's a high degree of certitude that they had gone to fight for ISIS in Syria. And our government tried to take steps. We made it a criminal code offense to travel to another country to participate in terrorist acts. That did not exist before. We also floated different ideas about, you know, designating certain countries as inadmissible to travel to. But one thing is clear, is that this government has done nothing to address the situation. And as ISIS deteriorates, there will be more and more people fleeing who have committed these kinds of atrocities. And you're very right to point out that this isn't people who have left to fight in a conventional war where they've picked a side. These are people who have joined a death cult, a genocidal terrorist organization. So we need a government to take this seriously and start talking about solutions. One of the things Ralph Goodell said in his answer was, you know, when they have the evidence to, you know, when they have met that threshold, then they prosecute. But we know that can take months and months and months, if at all. And so what we should be having a conversation about what does CSIS need? What does the RCMP need to be able to get to prosecutions? What types of tools do they need? And we need to have that conversation, because the answer to me is unacceptable that we just say, well, you know, can't do anything about it, so we just gotta, you know, brace ourselves and hope the reintegration programs work. Because these are people who have, there's a different breed of criminal here that we're talking about, people who have chosen to do the most evil kinds of acts imaginable.
Thank you very much.
All right, we'll open up the floor to the back a little bit here. Go ahead, you can ask your question.
Hi, Mr. Scheer. Thanks a lot for your remarks today, and congratulations once again on gaining the leadership position in the Conservative Party. I just wanted to get your thoughts on Canadian entrepreneurship, and especially high-tech innovation, high-tech growth, startups, and partnerships with universities, and what kind of environments we can create to foster that kind of innovation in Canada. Thank you.
Entrepreneurship is hugely important to grow an economy. Very few big businesses start off being big businesses. Most of them start off being small businesses that find the right formula for either a superior product or an innovative way of delivering a service. So we have to have kind of incubators of that type of, not just mentality, but also to provide people who would be entrepreneurs the tools they need. A big problem in Canada is access to capital and finding those resources for startups. And the previous government looked at different ways to do that. But fundamentally, I think sometimes, if we take a step back, some people think that an economy can be managed with a giant computer console. And you know, if we press some dials here and press some buttons here, pull in some levers, we can add some innovation, and we can provide some corporate subsidies that would lead to better products and services. And I tend to take a step back and say, government can't predict that. You know, you don't want the government trying to pull levers and pull strings to manage an economy. What we can do is we can make sure we have a very competitive environment to attract the best and the brightest and ensure that they can succeed when they do land on an innovative product or service or an innovative solution, whether it's in high tech or others. You know, the Kitchener-Waterloo area, did not become a hub of high-tech companies because there was a minister in Ottawa that decided that we were going to start a cluster there. It happens organically. And when you look back in history, it's the free market, free people making free decisions, voluntary transactions that innovate products and increase prosperity. In the 1970s, it took the average worker 2 weeks to save up enough money to buy a television. It took an average of 2 weeks worth of salary to buy a top-of-the-line model TV in 1970. Today, it takes the average worker 2 days to buy a top-of-the-line television today. And the television is infinitely better. So a much better product at a much smaller percentage of your working wage. That didn't happen because there was a minister of innovation that decided that he was going to have a television fairness policy. It happened because companies realized that to make a product more accessible to a wider group of consumers, they had to find ways to produce it more affordably. And in so doing, the other aspect of that competition is not just a better price, but a better product. So that drove the innovation, and that's why today we have the you consider, my kids were in my dad's house the other day, and they saw our old TV growing up, and they're just like, they didn't know what it was. Like, what is that weird thing with the big back sticking out? And so I think if from a conservative perspective, we should be looking at things on the macro level to attract investment, to make returns on investment more attractive here in Canada. We have partnerships with universities that provide training for the skills that are needed today. One of the things we did on training was, rather than try to guess what was needed, we partnered with companies who had skill shortages. And they said, look, I need a welder today, or I need a high-tech worker today. So our job training grants went to them. So they would hire a worker that was unskilled, provided on-the-job training for a need that they had today. Not so that in 4 years we might graduate someone who filled a need that may not exist in 4 years because the market forces shifted it. So I believe that's fundamentally a better approach, but I do believe that having that mind to encouraging entrepreneurship and finding ways of developing that is essentially important.
If I recognize you, you're from Liberal McGill, go ahead.
Awesome. Thank you, Andrew, for being here. First off, thank you for the selfie. The first one that here today. This week, we saw two huge foreign policy sort of game changers in the world. First off, Saad Hariri, the Prime Minister of Lebanon, came back from Saudi Arabia where he was supposedly held hostage. We are still waiting for reports to confirm that or not. And this is part of a big proxy war in the Middle East between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And the second one was the coup d'etat against Robert Mugabe, and tomorrow Emerson Mnangagwa will be sworn in as president of Zimbabwe. So my question to you is, what's Canada's role in the world? Because we are sort of seeing what this government wants to take a new sort of leadership in the world with, like the UK and the US stepping back and taking a more protectionist, make Great Britain great again, make America great again. What do you think we should be doing as Canadians?
Well, I might disagree with a little bit of the premise there, because I don't know that I've seen evidence that this government is trying to give Canada a leadership role. And I point to the peacekeeping announcement as evidence of that. Here we have a Liberal government who, for the past 18 months or so, was trumpeting that they were about to unveil a 21st century peacekeeping policy that would really knock your socks off, that would really, everyone would stand up around the world and say, wow, their slogan was Canada's back, right? The announcement just fizzled. It was some nebulous target without any clear path of how to get there, and ultimately delegating to the United Nations deployment of our troops. I believe very, very firmly that Canada should determine Canada's foreign policy objectives, and that any deployment of our men and women in the armed forces should be based along what's in Canada's national interest, or clearly linked to the foreign policy objectives that our government has articulated. Not just saying, hey, here you go, United Nations, the organization that originally made Robert Mugabe a goodwill ambassador, and gave Syria a spot on the was it the Human Rights Subcommittee of the United Nations? So rather than delegating to that organization where our men and women will go and put themselves in harm's way, I believe our government should deploy those based on Canada's national interests. In terms of what we should be doing, I think I've called for a peacekeeping mission in Ukraine, along the proposal of the Ukrainian government, recognizing the original borders and moving the conflict line back to the original borders, getting Russian troops out of that area. I think Vladimir Putin understands force and he understands concerted will and resolve. I think anytime you try to achieve nuance and dance around issues, I'm convinced that Putin just sees that as an opportunity to advance his interests. So I think Canada can play a leadership role in getting our allies in Europe to put more and more pressure for that peacekeeping mission. A lot of people have said, well, Russia's got to sit in the Security Council, so will the UN ever agree to a peacekeeping mission? Well, I believe that it is possible if we put that concerted effort with a strong resolve, not just leave it to the UN, say here's some troops, and if the UN can ever figure out what our policy should be to deploy it there. So I believe it's better to have a Made in Canada foreign policy objective to determine where we deploy our troops.
We've got time for one more question. Who's it going to be? All right, all the way back right there. Go ahead.
So my question is on the infrastructure. The Trudeau government proposed a $100 billion infrastructure plan.
Sorry, I'm having a little bit of trouble. If you don't mind coming up with it, just ask the question.
So my question is on, I'm from Concordia, so my question is on infrastructure. The Trudeau government proposed a $100 billion infrastructure plan. I don't know the details and how effective it is, but what is your view on infrastructure spending by government?
Very timely question. I have so many issues I could talk about in terms of infrastructure. The Parliamentary Budget Officer recently indicated that there are billions of dollars of unspent infrastructure dollars that haven't gone out the door as promised. And it's not that the municipalities aren't ready for it, it's just that the government hasn't managed to deliver it efficiently. They have two major flaws in their approach to infrastructure. One is the infrastructure bank. We always accepted and in fact promoted the idea that the private sector could help, we could leverage the private sector when it came to finding new dollars and more dollars to build infrastructure. But we believed in one important principle whenever embarking upon a partnership like that if you are going to give private sector interests the ability to reap the rewards from infrastructure projects, then they must carry the risk. The risk and reward must go together. What the infrastructure bank does is separates the risk and the reward. It lets private sector investors, multimillionaire individuals and multinational corporations reap the rewards for successful projects that come in on budget and have that return on that investment. They get the rewards. Who carries the risk? You do. The taxpayer backstops everything done by the Infrastructure Bank of Canada. So, will not shock you, many infrastructure projects go over budget or go beyond the timeline. And you will now pick up the tab for that so that the private sector interests keep the reward. That is not a free market solution, that is not a conservative principle. Risk and reward have to go together. It's not fair to ask taxpayers to backstop loans to help multinational and multi-millionaire individuals reap all the rewards for public infrastructure. When it comes to infrastructure dollars, though, they have announced more than $100 billion. In fact, sorry, I should, not just the $100 billion that they've announced, but they've also announced an additional $500 million for infrastructure, except not in Canada. They've announced that they will fund the Asian Infrastructure Bank, which of course builds infrastructure in Asia, for Asian countries. So not a single kilometer of road will be paved, not a single new bridge will be funded out of the Asian Infrastructure Bank here in Canada. And I don't know why we're asking you as a taxpayer who is living in a city that has infrastructure needs to send your tax dollars to a bank to pay for infrastructure in other countries. So we are opposed to the infrastructure bank because of the flawed model of separating risk and return. And we are opposed to the Liberal government's decision to participate in the Asian Infrastructure Bank because it sends infrastructure dollars outside of Canada instead of servicing the needs of Canadians.
Well, thank you so much, Andrew, and thank you for everyone who came out today. Now, before